The Tudor era witnessed countless executions, but the fire that consumed Margaret Cheyney remains one of its most brutal and haunting sentences. On May 25, 1537, she was burned at the stake at Smithfield in London, a public livestock market. This brutal combination of location and method was a standard administrative procedure typically reserved for common criminals and religious dissidents. As a woman of high nobility, she was convicted of high treason, a charge carrying the horrific penalty of the pyre for women. The true cause of her destruction lay entirely in her husband's defiance of the throne. Her public death was weaponized, forcing every noble wife to become an active enforcer of her family's loyalty to the king. The tragic fate of Margaret Cheyney was directly tied to the deep political insecurities of the early Tudor dynasty. King Henry VII had captured the English throne through battlefield conquest in 1485, creating a fragile foundation for his family's rule. The government operated under the constant underlying fear that their crown could just as easily be taken away by force. When King Henry VIII took power in 1509, he inherited this profound paranoia regarding his grip on the country. Because of this institutional insecurity, Henry VIII did not view the older noble families as loyal subjects or helpful advisors. Instead, he saw them as dangerous political rivals who needed to be strictly monitored and controlled. During this era, the general public still held deep respect for ancient aristocratic bloodlines. Any nobleman who accumulated significant wealth, public popularity, or private military forces was immediately flagged as a threat to the regime. Margaret was born in the early 16th century into one of these highly scrutinized families. Her father was Edward Stafford, the third Duke of Buckingham, who was arguably the most powerful nobleman in England at the time. He controlled massive estates across multiple counties and commanded a vast personal network of armed retainers. This immense wealth and independent power made him a prime target for the suspicious Tudor administration. Beyond his wealth, Buckingham possessed something far more dangerous to the king, a direct bloodline to King Edward III. This specific ancestry gave him a very real and legitimate alternative claim to the English throne. This genetic legacy was particularly terrifying to Henry VIII, who was struggling desperately to produce a healthy male heir to secure his own succession. To the king, Buckingham was not just a rich lord, but a glaring geopolitical liability. Buckingham worsened his own situation by entertaining local prophecies that predicted the early death of the king. When Tudor spies reported this behavior, the state moved swiftly to neutralize the perceived danger. In 1521, the government arrested the Duke of Buckingham, charged him with high treason, and executed him. This brutal act permanently destroyed the family's standing and left his daughter Margaret politically isolated and highly vulnerable. The trial established a concerning legal precedent. The prosecution did not present evidence of an armed uprising. The state built its case largely on circumstantial evidence, reported private conversations, and the testimonies of disgruntled household staff. After the Tudor court formally found Buckingham guilty of these charges, he was executed by beheading on Tower Hill, a brutal act that directly allowed the government to subsequently confiscate his massive estates and vast financial assets in their entirety. Margaret was an illegitimate daughter of the Duke, a legal status that fundamentally shaped her early existence. Born outside of a sanctioned marriage, she was legally barred from the Stafford inheritance, entirely unable to claim titles, lands, or any financial stipends from her father's massive estate. This illegitimacy carried a profound, unspoken emotional weight. While Buckingham's legitimate heirs desperately maneuvered to appease the crown and reclaim fractions of the family's shattered wealth, Margaret was treated as a disposable liability. Her legitimate half-siblings rapidly distanced themselves, viewing her not as blood, but as a dangerous loose end that could invite further royal scrutiny. She was left entirely adrift, grieving a father who had acknowledged her just enough to mark her with his fatal legacy, but not enough to provide her with any legal or financial sanctuary. However, her biological connection to the Stafford family remained a matter of public record. The Tudor court maintained detailed intelligence on the genealogical networks of the nobility. The administration was highly aware of her ancestry. She was the daughter of an executed traitor. This background placed Margaret under a permanent layer of state surveillance. She did not inherit wealth, but she inherited a political marker. The government classified individuals with such backgrounds as dormant risks. She was required to navigate her life, knowing the central authorities viewed her lineage with inherent suspicion. Coupled with the complexities of her ancestry was the restrictive legal reality of being a woman in 16th century England. The English common law operated under the strict doctrine of coverture. Coverture dictated the civil status of women. Under this doctrine, a woman essentially possessed no independent legal identity. Upon entering a marriage, her legal existence was entirely absorbed by her husband. The law recognized the married couple as a single corporate entity, and that entity was controlled exclusively by the male head of the household. The economic and legal restrictions were comprehensive. Under this system, she could neither purchase nor own any real estate in her own name, and she was strictly forbidden to sign legally binding contracts of any kind. Furthermore, she was completely stripped of the legal right to draft a valid will without her husband's explicit, documented permission, and was entirely barred from independently initiating or defending against lawsuits in a court of law. The state expected a wife to function as a compliant extension of her husband's authority. This legal framework was designed to consolidate wealth and maintain strict patriarchal order across all social classes. For a woman possessing Margaret's high-born ancestry and independent intellect, these rigid parameters created immediate, severe friction. Margaret's early life was directed by standard social protocols. Her family arranged her marriage to a man named William Cheyney. Historical documentation indicates Cheyney operated within the merchant class or the minor land-owning gentry. They resided in London or the immediate surrounding southern counties. The social environment of the capital city was strictly regulated. The merchant demographic adhered to rigid moral and operational codes. For a woman with Margaret's aristocratic background, the daily life of a merchant's wife in London offered very little personal or administrative autonomy. The societal expectations placed upon her were absolute. She was required to manage the domestic household, produce legitimate heirs, and remain legally and socially inconspicuous. The central government maintained close proximity to the London merchant class. ensuring strict adherence to civic and religious norms. Sometime during the 1520s, Margaret executed a decision that fundamentally altered her legal standing. She left William Cheyney. In Tudor England, separating from a spouse was a catastrophic social and legal maneuver. The modern concept of divorce did not exist. The Catholic Church strictly governed the institution of marriage. An official annulment was exceptionally difficult to procure. It was an expensive, lengthy legal process usually reserved for the highest echelons of the nobility, and it required specific canonical grounds. By departing her marital home, Margaret violated the strict moral codes of her society. The consequences were immediate. The law offered her zero protection or financial alimony. She forfeited her economic security. She lost her respectability within Southern high society. She effectively became a displaced individual. She lived outside the sanctioned boundaries of the common law and the ecclesiastical courts. The state viewed estranged women as disruptive elements to the social order. Leaving this sanctioned life was not merely a geographical departure. It was a psychological rupture born of profound despair. To remain in London meant submitting to a slow, suffocating erasure of her identity. The daily reality of her first marriage was defined by emotional alienation and the constant, unspoken pressure to atone for her father's treason through absolute, invisible obedience. When she finally fled, she was actively choosing the terrifying vulnerability of exile over the crushing certainty of a life lived as a voiceless prisoner within merchant-class respectability. Margaret turned away from London and the immediate jurisdiction of the royal court. She traveled north, eventually relocating to Yorkshire. To understand her subsequent actions, one must understand the distinct geopolitical reality of northern England in the 1520s. The North operated vastly differently from the southern counties. It was geographically isolated from the capital. The infrastructure was underdeveloped, rendering travel and governmental communication slow and inefficient. Because of this logistical isolation, the region was heavily controlled by powerful established feudal families. Houses like the Percys, the Nevilles, and the Bulmers governed expansive territories. They commanded their own private military retinues. They enforced local jurisprudence. The population of the northern counties often demonstrated a stronger, more immediate loyalty to these regional lords than to the distant monarch in London. The culture was traditional, resilient, and fiercely protective of its regional autonomy. It was within this environment that Margaret found a society less concerned with the strict civic codes of the capital. In Yorkshire, Margaret intersected with the regional power structure. She met Sir John Bulmer. Sir John was a formidable northern administrator. He commanded significant respect and localized military power. He managed extensive estates. His primary operational base was the imposing structure of Wilton Castle. He was a man of substantial influence within the northern political ecosystem. However, a major legal complication existed regarding their relationship. Sir John Bulmer was legally married to a woman named Anne Bigod. Despite this fact, Margaret and John established an open partnership. They bypassed the strictures of the church and the state. They cohabitated openly at Wilton Castle. Margaret assumed the significant responsibilities of managing the household logistics and the administrative duties of the estates. Proving to be a highly capable estate manager, Margaret earned the professional respect of local leadership through her sheer intellect and administrative efficiency. Against all odds, she successfully rebuilt her position on her own terms, securing authority in a region defined by its harsh political climate. Yet the central government in London maintained detailed intelligence records. The royal ministers viewed her reinvention with deep skepticism. They considered her marriage status to be irregular and legally invalid. They remembered her as a woman who had abandoned her sanctioned role in London. Margaret had constructed a powerful administrative life in Yorkshire. However, the legal and political foundation of that life remained highly vulnerable. The tension between the independent northern lords and the centralizing power of King Henry VIII's government was steadily increasing. A collision between the region and the crown was inevitable. The geopolitical tension between the northern nobility and the central government reached a critical threshold in 1536. King Henry VIII had officially severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England under his direct supremacy. This monumental theological and legal shift was rapidly followed by a severe economic policy directed by Thomas Cromwell, the dissolution of the monasteries. The crown ordered the systemic closure of religious houses throughout the realm. The state confiscated massive tracts of monastic land, seized ecclesiastical wealth, and stripped lead from abbey roofs to fund the king's projects and enrich his loyal supporters. While the southern and central counties managed the transition with relative stability, the policy was catastrophic for the north. The northern counties were historically and culturally traditional. They remained deeply attached to Orthodox Catholic practices. More importantly, the social and economic infrastructure of the North was heavily reliant on the monastic system. In an isolated region with limited governmental infrastructure, the abbeys were not merely places of worship. They functioned as the primary providers of charity, medical care, education, and employment for the rural population. To the northern populace and the regional nobility, the king's commissioners appeared not as religious reformers, but as an invading force actively destroying the foundation of their society. The immediate result was the Pilgrimage of Grace in late 1536. This event stands as the most significant and structurally organized domestic rebellion of the entire Tudor era. This was not a spontaneous, disorganized riot. It was a highly structured, cross-demographic movement. Tens of thousands of armed individuals, encompassing commoners, the local gentry, and the priesthood, mobilized across the northern counties. They marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. Their primary demands were conservative, not revolutionary. They demanded the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of specific ministers, primarily Thomas Cromwell, from the king's council, and the cessation of religious innovations. A rebellion of this scale required sophisticated logistics, secure communication lines, and fortified strongholds. The northern lords were forced to align themselves. Sir John Bulmer emerged as a central operational figure within the Pilgrimage of Grace. He commanded significant respect and mobilized local military forces. Consequently, the operational function of Wilton Castle transformed entirely. It transitioned from a noble residence into a militarized nerve center for the rebel forces. During this severe national crisis, Margaret Cheyney, functioning as Lady Bulmer, demonstrated her administrative capacity. Under her direct supervision, Wilton Castle became a critical logistics hub. The fortress served as a secure meeting point for rebel commanders. It was utilized for stockpiling provisions and armaments. It functioned as a secure relay station for covert communications between disparate rebel contingents operating across Yorkshire. Margaret did not engage in physical combat, but her intellect, her organizational oversight, and her total commitment to her husband's position rendered her an indispensable asset to the rebellion's infrastructure. She was actively facilitating the largest domestic threat King Henry VIII had ever encountered. For a brief period in the winter of 1536, the rebel forces held a definitive strategic advantage. They vastly outnumbered the royal armies mobilized to intercept them. The threat of a full-scale civil war was imminent. King Henry VIII, recognizing his immediate military vulnerability, deployed a highly effective diplomatic strategy. He avoided direct military engagement. Instead, he authorized his representatives to negotiate a settlement. In December 1536, the king offered a comprehensive blanket pardon to the rebel forces. He guaranteed that if they dispersed peacefully, their grievances would be formally addressed in a free parliament scheduled to convene in York. Crucially, the crown promised complete amnesty for all participants in the initial uprising. The rebel leadership, lacking the fundamental desire to overthrow the monarch and trusting the formal word of the sovereign, accepted the terms. The armies disbanded. The initial phase of the Pilgrimage of Grace concluded through negotiation, not combat. The northern lords made a fatal strategic error. They misunderstood the operational psychology of King Henry VIII. The king viewed the rebellion as a profound personal humiliation and an intolerable challenge to his absolute authority. He possessed no intention of honoring the negotiated terms. The pardon was merely a tactical maneuver to buy time to marshal and deploy a superior military force. The fragile peace shattered in January 1537. A second, significantly smaller and poorly coordinated uprising occurred in the north. Disastrously for Margaret and the Bulmer faction, this secondary rebellion was led by Sir Francis Bigod, the nephew of Sir John Bulmer through his first marriage. This localized uprising provided the crown with the required legal pretext. King Henry immediately declared that the rebels had violated the terms of the amnesty. He formally revoked all prior pardons. The king deployed the Duke of Norfolk to the northern counties with an absolute terrifying mandate: institute martial law, arrest the leadership structure of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and execute a severe military purge to ensure the permanent pacification of the region. The central government's trap had closed. The Duke of Norfolk advanced across Yorkshire with a mandate for severe military pacification. The political reality at Wilton Castle shifted immediately. The central government was no longer negotiating. It was executing a systematic purge of the regional leadership. Margaret's primary objective transitioned from supporting a regional rebellion to ensuring the immediate survival of her household. The state would later cite 3 specific actions from this period to construct its legal case against her. It is critical to note that these were not acts of armed warfare. They were calculated defensive maneuvers. First, the Duke of Norfolk issued a formal summons. He ordered Sir John Bulmer to present himself for questioning. Margaret, analyzed the political climate. She recognized the summons as a tactical trap. She advised her husband to reject the order. She actively concealed his location within the fortified estate. She argued that surrendering to Norfolk guaranteed immediate arrest and execution. To Margaret, this was a logical protective measure. To the Tudor legal apparatus, this action constituted active incitement. The state did not recognize marital loyalty as a valid defense against royal authority. The prosecution interpreted her advice as counseling a subject to disobey a direct command from the king's representative. Second, the royal forces tightened their perimeter around the northern estates. Margaret and John formulated a rapid evacuation protocol. Remaining within English jurisdiction presented an unacceptable risk to their lives. They began consolidating their liquid assets. They secured reserves of gold and silver currency. They discreetly mapped an extraction route intended to take them across the northern border into Scotland. The Tudor legal code viewed Scotland as a hostile foreign jurisdiction. Under existing statutes, attempting to move English currency and nobility across this specific border was a severe offense. The state classified this planned evacuation as collaborating with an enemy power. Third, Margaret was accused of participating in restricted strategic discussions regarding localized resistance. The prosecution alleged she was present during conversations about raising local civilian militias. The stated objective of these militias was to ambush the Duke of Norfolk's advance guard, thereby securing a safe quarter for their escape. A critical logistical question arises at this juncture. How did the central government uncover private, heavily guarded discussions occurring behind the thick stone walls of a northern fortress? The answer lies in the intelligence infrastructure constructed by Thomas Cromwell. Henry VIII's chief minister had fundamentally modernized state security. He did not rely exclusively on military deployments. He utilized a sophisticated, highly efficient network of informants and surveillance protocols. When royal troops finally breached the fortified perimeter of Wilton Castle, their immediate objective extended far beyond simply detaining the primary nobility. Executing a harsh, standardized operational procedure, the soldiers immediately isolated and arrested the entire administrative and domestic staff of the household, subsequently transporting these terrified servants to secure holding facilities where they were subjected to rigorous, highly coercive interrogation techniques. The Tudor judicial system legally permitted the application of physical pressure. This was a standard investigative tool used to extract intelligence in matters of national security. Faced with the machinery of state interrogation and the explicit threat of physical pain, the household staff provided comprehensive depositions. They detailed the consolidation of financial assets. They outlined the proposed escape route to Scotland. They repeated the specific defensive counsel Margaret had provided to her husband. The state effectively weaponized the internal workforce of Wilton Castle against its own administrators. The resulting depositions represented a profound personal and psychological violation. These were not anonymous witnesses. These were individuals Margaret had directly managed, provided for, and protected during the severe economic and political instability of the northern crises. The realization that her own household had been broken by Cromwell's agents to become the primary instruments of her demise added an excruciating layer of betrayal to her terror. The sanctuary she had so painstakingly built in Yorkshire had been completely inverted, its own inhabitants used to forge the chains of her condemnation. The intelligence gathered from the household staff provided a strong foundational case. However, the most critical and damaging piece of evidence originated from Margaret's own partner. Royal forces successfully captured Sir John Bulmer. They transported him under heavy guard to London. He was incarcerated within the Tower of London. He faced the standard execution protocol for male traitors. This protocol involved hanging, drawing, and quartering. Sir John evaluated his position. Under the psychological pressure of isolation and the absolute certainty of his impending sentence, his resistance collapsed. He requested an audience with the king's inquisitors. He provided a formal sweeping confession. In his extensive sworn testimony, he deliberately branded her as the principal architect of their actions, stating unequivocally that she had aggressively urged his active participation in the Pilgrimage of Grace. Furthermore, he testified that she had entirely engineered the illicit escape plan to Scotland, formally labeling his own wife as the primary driving operational force behind all of his anti-government defiance. Margaret was incarcerated in a separate facility. She was entirely isolated from her northern communication networks and allies. The prosecution presented her with the collected depositions. She was forced to process a harsh operational reality. The individual she had actively attempted to protect had formally implicated her to negotiate his own survival. Adding an excruciating layer of psychological torment to this betrayal was the inescapable cyclical nature of her trauma. Margaret had spent her entire existence attempting to outrun the executioner's shadow that had brutally consumed her father. She had sacrificed her remaining social standing, endured the stigma of abandoning her first husband, and navigated the treacherous, male-dominated power structures of the North, all to carve out a sliver of safety and self-determination. Yet as she sat in the damp, lightless confines of her cell, she was forced to confront a shattering realization. Every desperate, calculated risk she had taken to break free from her father's doomed legacy had only woven the Tudor snare tighter around her own throat. Her pursuit of agency had become the very instrument of her absolute destruction. Beyond her own impending doom, the tragedy of her motherhood inflicted a unique, unquantifiable agony. During her years in Yorkshire, she had built a family, bearing at least one son with the man who had just condemned her to die. In Tudor England, a mother imprisoned for treason knew with terrifying certainty that her execution was only the beginning of her family's punishment. She had to endure the soul-crushing knowledge that her conviction would instantly render her children legal pariahs. They would be stripped of any potential inheritance, cast into the world as impoverished outcasts, and forever branded with the radioactive stigma of their mother's fiery end. The regime was not simply demanding her life. It was methodically erasing the future of the children she was entirely powerless to protect. Historical evidence suggests this agonizing separation from her family occurred with brutal, immediate force. When royal soldiers secured Wilton Castle, Margaret was violently torn from her domestic environment, denied even the briefest opportunity to secure provisions or offer parting comforts to her dependents. The grueling journey southward to London was a protracted psychological torture where every mile traveled physically mirrored the permanent, violent severing of her maternal bonds. She arrived at the tower not merely as a condemned traitor, but as a shattered mother, haunted by the echoing reality that her ultimate act of maternal love was her absolute failure to shield her offspring from the Tudor state. The emotional devastation of this isolation was absolute. Unlike the male nobility who often found fleeting camaraderie or the hollow comfort of a shared aristocratic doom within the tower's walls, Margaret was denied even the dignity of her assumed title, stripped of her name and deliberately severed from the aristocratic networks that might have offered a shred of final solidarity. She was left to face the incomprehensible terror of the pyre entirely alone. She was a woman abandoned by her husband, weaponized by her servants, targeted by her king, and forcibly separated from her children, waiting in the dark for a death designed to be as agonizing as her life had become. The state now possessed the confessions of the staff and the sworn testimony of Sir John Bulmer. However, executing Margaret Cheyney required the government to navigate a specific legal hurdle. The traditional Treason Act of 1351 governed capital offenses against the state. Securing a conviction for high treason under this act required the prosecution to prove an overt physical act of war. The accused had to raise an army or physically levy war against the king's forces. Margaret's documented actions, advising her husband to hide, gathering funds, and discussing an escape, were defensive and preparatory. They did not meet the traditional threshold for high treason. Legally, these actions aligned with a lesser charge known as misprision of treason. This legal term designated the crime of concealing a traitor or failing to report treasonous acts to the authorities. The punishment for misprision was severe. It mandated life imprisonment and the total forfeiture of all assets. Crucially, however, it did not authorize the death penalty. Thomas Cromwell intended to secure a death sentence. To resolve the discrepancy between her actions and the law, he utilized a newly engineered piece of legislation, the Treason Act of 1534. This act fundamentally expanded the legal definition of treason in England. It established a terrifying new standard. It decreed that spoken words, verbalized thoughts, and stated intentions carried the exact same legal gravity as physical acts of warfare. The Crown's prosecutors applied this new standard to Margaret's case. They elevated her private conversations. They took her defensive advice and her evacuation plans and argued that these words demonstrated a malicious intent to undermine the monarch. Through the application of the 1534 Act, the state formally charged her with high treason. Before the trial commenced, Thomas Cromwell executed a critical administrative maneuver. He required a specific outcome regarding the method of execution. If the state tried and convicted the defendant as Lady Bulmer, the unwritten protocols of the aristocracy applied. For a woman of high nobility convicted of high treason, there was traditionally one escape from the pyre, the royal prerogative. The king possessed the authority to commute the sentence of burning to a swift, private decapitation by the axe. This was not an inherent legal right, it was an exclusive aristocratic privilege. The central government rejected this outcome. Cromwell intended to utilize her execution as a definitive public warning to the northern nobility. He required a highly visible, maximally degrading method of execution. To achieve this, the prosecution initiated a systematic process of identity stripping. The state formally refused to recognize her marriage to Sir John Bulmer. The Crown utilized her previous estranged marriage in London to define her legal status. In all official indictments, court transcripts, and state correspondence, the title Lady Bulmer was entirely erased. The prosecution mandated that she be referred to exclusively as Margaret Cheyney, wife of William Cheyney. The official record further appended the phrase, currently living in adulterous concubinage with John Bulmer. This administrative relabeling was not a minor clerical detail. It was a precise legal demotion. With a few strokes of a quill, the Tudor state revoked her social standing. The prosecution legally disconnected her from the powerful Bulmer faction. They severed her recognized association with the northern aristocracy. In the eyes of the court, she was no longer a regional administrator or a noblewoman of Plantagenet descent. She was legally redefined as a commoner originating from the merchant class. Furthermore, the court highlighted her estrangement from William Cheyney to brand her as an individual of severe moral failure. By restructuring her civic identity, the government deliberately stripped away the aristocratic shield that might have saved her from the flames. The prosecution strategy was not to invent new charges, but to completely neutralize any possibility of royal mercy. In Tudor law, securing a conviction for high treason carried a mandatory, brutal death sentence with a strict gender dichotomy. For a man, it was hanging, drawing, and quartering. For a woman, because the state deemed public dismemberment an unacceptable violation of modesty, the legally standard penalty was burning alive. The government engineered her social identity to guarantee she would face this absolute, unmitigated terror of the common traitor's death. Having secured the legal mechanism through the Treason Act of 1534 and neutralized her aristocratic privileges, the Tudor government initiated the formal trial phase in May 1537. Margaret Cheyney was not processed through standard civil or ecclesiastical courts. The state subjected her to an oyer and terminer commission. The term translates from Old French as to hear and to determine. These were special judicial commissions established directly by the Crown. The government utilized them specifically to expedite cases of treason, rebellion, and severe threats to national security. An oyer and terminer court operated under distinct procedural rules. The primary objective of these commissions was not the objective discovery of truth. The objective was the rapid, formalized validation of the state's prior investigations. The legal architecture was heavily weighted in favor of the prosecution. The procedural safeguards available to a modern defendant were entirely absent. Margaret was denied the right to legal counsel. The Tudor legal doctrine dictated that in cases of treason, the judge served as the defendant's counsel. In reality, the judges were royal appointees, tasked with securing convictions. Furthermore, she was forbidden from calling witnesses to testify on her behalf. She was not permitted to cross-examine the individuals who had provided depositions against her. The court did not allow her to review the formal indictment or the specific charges until she was standing in the courtroom, required to enter a plea. The trial utilized a jury, but the composition and function of a Tudor jury differed fundamentally from modern standards. The jury was not an impartial panel of peers. The local sheriff, an official appointed by and loyal to the central government, selected the jurors. In high-profile treason trials managed by Thomas Cromwell, the jury selection was meticulously controlled. The state selected individuals who understood the political climate. The jurors operated under immense administrative pressure. They were fully aware of the king's interest in the pilgrimage of grace prosecutions. Returning a not guilty verdict against the explicit wishes of the crown carried severe personal and professional risks. Juries that defied the government could be fined, imprisoned, or investigated for sedition themselves. Margaret faced a tribunal designed to process convictions efficiently. She was isolated, lacking legal representation, and confronted by a jury acutely aware of the political requirements of the regime. Despite her isolation, the lack of counsel, and the knowledge of her husband's written testimony against her, the initial court records indicate Margaret maintained a defensive posture. When she was formally asked by the tribunal to enter a plea, she firmly stated that she was not guilty, courageously refusing to immediately validate or surrender to the state's twisted and heavily biased legal framework. However, the structural realities of the Tudor judicial system offered no viable path for defense. The state possessed the physical evidence of the hoarded currency. They possessed the sworn depositions of the Wilton Castle staff. They held the formal confession of Sir John Bulmer. Prolonging the trial through a not guilty plea often resulted in further coercive interrogation or harsher conditions of confinement. Defendants in Tudor treason trials frequently recognized the futility of their position. Under sustained procedural pressure and recognizing the absolute impossibility of an acquittal, Margaret was eventually compelled to alter her plea. She formally submitted a plea of guilty to the charges presented. The commission immediately moved to sentencing. The presiding officials pronounced the verdict dictated by their calculated legal strategy. The court condemned Margaret Cheyney to be drawn to the place of execution and burned until dead. The administrative process was complete. The state prepared for the public execution. The Tudor state scheduled the final phase of its judicial process for May 25, 1537. The central government coordinated multiple executions for that morning. The objective was the simultaneous elimination of the remaining leadership from the pilgrimage of grace. The operational protocol began with physical separation. The authorities permanently isolated Margaret from Sir John Bulmer. The government mandated their executions to occur at separate locations, utilizing entirely different penal methods. The state transported Sir John Bulmer to Tyburn. Tyburn served as the primary execution ground for common criminals and male political dissidents in the capital. The executioners subjected him to the standard, highly regulated penalty for high treason. He was hanged until he lost consciousness, lowered to the ground, and subjected to disembowelment and quartering. While severe, his execution followed the established legal precedent for a man of his status convicted of armed rebellion. The state treated him as a military combatant who had committed treason. Margaret's execution protocol was distinctly different. The authorities did not transfer her to Tower Green. Tower Green was the enclosed, secure space within the Tower of London typically utilized for high-ranking noblewomen. Instead, the guards secured her to a hurdle. A hurdle was a flat, unwheeled wooden frame. the state ordered her drawn by horse through the public streets of London. The destination for the hurdle was Smithfield. To fully analyze the severity of this administrative decision, one must examine the sociological geography of 16th century London. Smithfield was not an execution site associated with dignity or the aristocracy. It functioned primarily as the city's central livestock market and commercial slaughterhouse. Historically, the state designated Smithfield for the execution of religious heretics, individuals accused of witchcraft, and offenders classified in the lowest tier of the criminal hierarchy. Transporting a woman of Plantagenet descent to a livestock market constituted a calculated, highly public demotion. It was a visual demonstration designed to finalize the process of identity stripping initiated during the trial. By executing her at Smithfield, the Crown visually communicated a specific political message to the observing public. The government established that Margaret Cheyney possessed no residual aristocratic value. The state equated her execution with the disposal of a common criminal. Upon arrival at the Smithfield market, Margaret underwent the final procedural steps. Officials divested her of all outer garments, leaving her in a standard, unadorned linen shift. Executioners then secured her to a heavy wooden post in the center of the prepared pyre using thick industrial iron chains. While in later decades, particularly during the intense religious persecutions of the 1550s, executioners might sometimes allow a localized explosion of gunpowder to grant the condemned a swifter, concussive death. The brutal political climate of 1537 offered no such mercies. The Tudor administration required the full, agonizing reality of the sentence to unfold publicly. The state intended this execution to function not merely as a punishment, but as an absolute maximum deterrent, entirely devoid of systemic compassion or unofficial leniency. The physiological mechanism of execution by fire is a subject of clinical documentation. When the executioners ignited the pyre, the immediate cause of death was rarely the direct contact with the flames. The combustion of large quantities of wood, both green and dry, produced extensive smoke and lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide. As the fire developed, the ambient temperature surrounding the post rose rapidly. When the condemned inhaled the superheated air, it caused instantaneous thermal trauma to the respiratory tract. In such environments, the human larynx typically swells and closes rapidly as a physiological defense mechanism. Simultaneously, the inhalation of carbon monoxide displaces oxygen in the bloodstream. Within a short time frame, the primary cause of clinical death was asphyxiation and cerebral hypoxia. The individual lost consciousness and expired due to a total lack of oxygen to the brain. Following clinical death, the authorities maintained the fire. The judicial sentence required the total physical destruction of the remains. The ultimate objective of the fire at Smithfield extended far beyond the mere extinguishing of a human life. By reducing Margaret Cheyney entirely to ash, the Tudor administration executed a flawless campaign of damnatio memoriae. They ensured no physical body remained to be claimed, and no monument could ever be erected to serve as a geographical rallying point for future dissent. Her public death was a cold, calculated political broadcast that fundamentally shattered the ancient legal doctrine of coverture. For generations, the law had demanded a wife's absolute, unquestioning submission to her husband. Yet the flames at Smithfield established a terrifying new precedent. A subject's loyalty to the sovereign definitively supersedes the marital bond. The state made it unequivocally clear that if a wife facilitated her husband's defiance or even offered him defensive counsel, she would no longer be protected as a subordinate, but executed as a treasonous mastermind. This brutal execution successfully dismantled any lingering illusions of aristocratic invulnerability. The northern elite realized with horrifying clarity that their ancient bloodlines and massive estates offered no protection against the centralized machinery of the crown. A profound, terrified silence descended across the English nobility. The state effectively outsourced its surveillance, transforming the very heart of the aristocratic household into an extension of the king's paranoia. To survive this new era, noble women were forced to become the active enforcers of political compliance within their own homes. Margaret Cheyney was not a victim of random, disorganized cruelty. Her erasure was a masterpiece of legal weaponization, a definitive demonstration of an authoritarian regime bending the law and utilizing psychological terror to force an entire nation into total submission.